All right, so it's 2021. It's arguably the worst time in recent history to be trying to build a machine. Everything seems to be out of stock, and if you find it in stock anywhere, it's twice the price it should be. But you're here watching this, so I'm going to assume you bought some hardware and hope you didn't get ripped off. We're going to go over today how to build a PC from scratch. So you're going to need some basic components. You're going to need your motherboard. This is what everything connects to. It's how everything talks to each other. You're going to need your processor, which I've already got in here, but I'll take it out to show you the installation. You need your graphics card. If it's a gaming PC, that's going to be the most important part for you. You need your RAM. You're going to need the CPU cooler to make sure your CPU stays cool, and a power supply to power it all. Finally, you'll need somewhere to house it, and so you get the case of your choice. I've gone with the BeQuiet 500DX because it's got great airflow and it's made by BeQuiet, so it's quiet. For the power supply, I've got a Corsair RM850x. The graphics card is an Nvidea 3070Fe. Motherboard is the Aorus Pro B550. Processor is the AMD 3700X, and the CPU cooler is a BeQuiet Dark Rock 4. The first thing you're going to want to do is get your processor in the motherboard. What you're going to want to do is lift this arm, which releases the socket, and on your processor, one of the edges has a small arrow on it, if it will focus, and that lines up with the small arrow, that small arrow there on the edge of the socket to let you know which way it's meant to go in. So carefully place that in your socket and put the arm back down that will lock it in place. Next, you're going to want to mount your cooler. Mine attaches to the built-in AMD bracket at the back, so all I had to do was screw in these two parts here. And now on top of that, the cooler will go on and the holes will line up, and that's what will hold it in place. Now before you do this, you will need some thermal paste or thermal compound. The one I'm using is MX4. It's quite widely known. It's regarded as some of the best for the price, and you get it easily on Amazon. So what you're aiming for is a pea-size amount right in the middle of the chip. And then when you put on the cooler, it'll spread that out evenly over the rest of the chip. Now you grab your cooler, line the bar up with where it'll need to be. Pre-fit one of your screws. Just hand tighten it. On the other side, do the same thing. And then give them a proper tighten with your screwdriver. Now you want to fit your fan. So for me, I've found it's actually easier to connect these first. They just go in these grooves here. And they come around the front, and these small hooks will go into the mounting holes of your fan. So just make sure they are sitting flush in the grill. And your fan should be resting, if you're using the Dark Rock 4 of course, your fan should be resting against these rubber parts that stop it from making any noise when it vibrates. Then you go ahead and you plug this into the CPU fan header on your motherboard. At this point you can now install your RAM as well. The notch in DDR4 is not dead center, it is slightly off center, so make sure you have it lined up the correct way. And you can seat it in your slots. You should check your motherboard's manual at this point, because to run them in dual channel you want to populate them in the same slots, so AA or BB for example. And all you do, I should have pointed that out, all you do is you open up these holders here, you line it up and you push down at each edge until you hear it click. And that's your RAM in place. I should also have mentioned I'm actually moving case, this isn't a brand new build. So I've pre-installed my M2 hard drive here. There is another slot on this motherboard, but because this is an old SATA PCIe rather than NVMe, it only works in this top slot on this motherboard. And all you do to get into those is unscrew the cover. Lift the cover out, and the M2, it slots in the bottom slot there. And what this motherboard gives you is these, it's almost like a cooling block. So you're meant to peel this off, stick the thermal pad to your M2 and connect it on again. But mine's, like I said, it's an old M2, it's a SATA, not an NVMe, it's a smaller drive. So I do only plan on having it in there temporarily. So I'm not going to waste the thermal pad by attaching it. So now you have your motherboard looking semi-complete, it's time to get it in the case. The first thing you're going to want to do with your case is get your power supply installed. I would take off all your side panels. And on this case specifically, you have quite a nice, easy mounting solution for your power supply. You just put the power supply in, put this behind it, and screw it back in. So line this up with the screws on your power supply, and then screw it into your power supply. Now your power supply should slide straight in, and screw in using the screws on the shroud. Now I know from reading online that the EPS cable is meant to be a nightmare to connect into the motherboard after you've got the motherboard in this case. So I went ahead and pre-ran the EPS cable, and we can connect that before we screw in the motherboard. So now all you do is there should be 9 screw holes on your motherboard that should line up with these 3 standoffs. So go ahead and pop your motherboard in there and hopefully they line up. So I'm going to move this off to the side to get that troublesome EPS cable plugged in. And yeah, that was a nightmare. I understand why people say it's a nightmare. So now you go ahead and you screw in the 9 screw holes, which one is actually up in that corner. And then you should be good to go. I mentioned 9 screw holes, but the 9th one there is actually just a standoff that takes the weight off the middle of the board. So now we need to run the rest of the power cables and the cables that connect from the header at the front of the case into things like your USB header, your tiny little header cables, which are also a nightmare. They're for things like your power LED and your hard drive activity indicator. So for your power cables, you're going to have one that goes into the top of your motherboard, up in there, and that's called the EPS cable. You're going to have the big 24-pin power into the side of the motherboard, and of course you're going to need power for your graphics card as well as any other accessories you've got. I've got 2 SSDs in there. They're going to need SATA power, and the LEDs for the front of this case and the inside of this case also need SATA power. So let's run some cables. If you've seen my last video, you know that I'm using these cable extensions. They just make things a bit nicer inside, and because they don't have these thick capacitors on the end, it does mean that you can bend them more and it'll be easier to get them into the motherboard. So I'm just going to connect this onto the power supply from the power cable from the power supply. And then I'm going to pass it through this little slot. Bend it into place and connect it to the motherboard. And the problem might be hiding this cable, because it is an extension. You've got an extra 30 centimeters of cable to take into consideration, and try and find somewhere nice and neat for it behind the case. Next I'll run the power for the graphics card. Hopefully we can have it coming out of one of these so that it's nice and neat. I was lucky enough to pick up one of the 3070 FEs. The only downside to them is you have to use this 12-pin adapter. So there's no shiny red cable for that one, I'm afraid. Now you're going to want to connect your system fans. I have one at the front blowing air in, one at the top exhausting, and one at the back exhausting. So you're just going to want to connect them into the fan headers of your motherboard, which I'll show you here. For me, I've got system fan 4, system fan 2, and system fan 5, and that's where I'm going to connect these 4-pin PWMs to. You'll notice that there's an indent on the cable there, and that goes into that piece of plastic beside the fan, beside the pins. At this point, you could go ahead and install your graphics card. You are going to need to remove some of these covers, the blanking slots for the PCIe. So put your card in, figure out which slots it's going to line up against, and then remove those. So for me, using this top slot here, you can see that it's not the top one, but the next 2 down that I need to remove. And now the graphics card should slot in there. Just make sure that if you have a clip for your PCIe slot, you've pressed it back out of the way. Looks like I'm an idiot, and you also have to remove this. And if everything's lining up as it should, a simple push should have everything click into place. And now you can re-add these screws to take the weight off the graphics card, and add this cover back in its place. Once that's done, you can go ahead and connect back the power to your graphics card. You're going to want to connect your SATA power. This for me is going to power the two SSDs and also the LEDs as well. The good thing about the PSU being in using this shroud is if you can't quite reach where this needs to plug into, you can just pull it out a little bit to give yourself more room. Or pull it out completely if you're properly struggling. And depending on your case, you might have a SATA connector like me for these LEDs. And what that looks like is this. This is coming from the case. And all you do is connect that into a standard SATA power supply. It's a little L shape, and it just lines up with your connector there. And that will now supply power to the front LEDs and the internal LED strip too. And if your motherboard does support it, you can plug the RGB header into the motherboard. That way your motherboard can synchronize the lights on the front and the inside with any other lights that it's also controlling. And now you need to run the rest of these case cables to your motherboard. So your USB one's nice and easy, it's quite chunky. There's only one way it goes in because it's got the tab on the top. So connect that up. Your front panel audio will only also go in one way because there's a pin missing. So have a look at your board, find out which way the missing pin goes, and then connect it up. As I'm going, I am trying to keep the cables as neat as possible. Sometimes, like this one, it's easier said than done. Now you've got these tiny fiddly ones, and what they are is the power switch, so you can turn your machine on and off. And this one is the LED power, so all that does is light up the power button to let you know that it is actually turned on. Thankfully, some motherboard suppliers send these out with their motherboards. So instead of having to put them directly in there, pin by pin, you can put them into these adapters first and then just slot the adapter down into that hole. Believe me, it makes life a hell of a lot easier. So have a look on here. This is your power LED plus and minus. So take your power LED plus, pop it down into the adapter. Power LED minus, down into the adapter. And then you're looking for your power switch, which on this is just going to be power. And after you've got them plugged in, look at which way around this is meant to connect. You can see that's the correct way because you've got the long space there and the short space there. Turn that around and get that plugged in. And the last thing for us to do is the SATA cables that will allow the hard drives to be seen by Windows. So let's get them plugged in and we should be done. Connect the two ends of the SATA into your hard drives. And then tidy up these cables before you put the case back together. Of course, that's when you find you've missed one cable that needs to be plugged into your power supply. And you're done. Now, this is arguably the most important part. You close your eyes and you pray really hard to the computer gods that when you push the power button, there is actually life in this machine. And there you go, that's it. You've built your gaming machine. If you learn anything from this video, it's make sure everything's plugged in right. If for some reason your machine doesn't boot, go back, double check every cable, make sure it's connected where it should be. Make sure it's connected at both ends and not hanging out the back, still waiting to be plugged into your power supply. If it still doesn't boot, you could have a piece of hardware that has arrived dead. If possible, check it with another piece of hardware. Maybe you've got a friend or a colleague that'll lend you a processor, motherboard, power supply. If not, you can always order replacement parts and you can ship them back within 14 days free of charge. Hopefully this has helped some of you out. If it has, hit like, hit subscribe, and we'll see you again next time.